This podcast contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing content related to real-life events, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey, all you true crime fans out there. I know you guys are as fascinated by serial killers as I am, but have you ever wondered, why we don't hear about as many these days? It seems like that whole era of, infamous serial killers, the ones that really just sent chills down our spines, it feels like it might be over. So to unpack this mystery, we're doing deep dive today into some really interesting articles from MagellanTV, Discover Magazine, and Northeastern University. So we've got a good mix of perspectives here, like historical context and some insights from criminology, even taking a look at how society itself has changed.
Yeah, it really is a puzzle, isn't it? We've got all these pieces, forensic psychology, sociology, and we're just trying to figure out how it all fits together to try and explain this, apparent decline.
Right, and to try and, start putting the pieces together, we need to go back to what criminologists call the golden age of serial murder.
Yeah.
So this period was roughly, from 1970 to 2000. And it saw a crazy number of active serial killers.
Yeah, the numbers are wild. Think about this. In 1987 alone, there were 198 serial killers active in the U.S., and they were responsible for 404 victims. That's an average of, more than 2 victims per killer, just in that 1 year.
Whoa, okay. Yeah, that really puts it into perspective. It's hard to imagine that happening today. But before we get into why things might have changed, I'm curious what factors contributed to this golden age in the first place.
Well, a few things were happening all at the same time. So the late 60s and 70s, that saw this cultural shift, with women gaining more independence, which was a good thing overall, obviously. But it also meant that women were more likely to be out and about on their own, which unfortunately increased their exposure to predators.
Oh, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of it that way before, that increased freedom came with, increased risk.
Exactly. And on top of that, we had the rise of the interstate highway system, and, cities were growing, so this gave more anonymity to people who wanted to prey on others, and unfortunately made it easier to find victims over a wider area.
So it was almost like the perfect storm. All these social and infrastructural changes created way more opportunities for these crimes to happen.
Yeah, you could say that. And there's another factor that often gets missed. The term serial killer. It was only coined in the 1970s. Before that, even if these crimes were happening, they weren't really recognized or reported in the same way.
So by giving it a name, it actually increased awareness. That's so interesting.
Exactly. It was like shining a light on something that was always there, but hidden in the shadows. And that awareness helped law enforcement and researchers to start connecting the dots and to study these crimes in a much more focused way.
Okay, so we've got a better picture now of why that golden age happened. But what about the decline? What led to fewer serial killers being caught?
Well, one of the biggest things has been the changes in forensic science. DNA technology has been huge, especially with databases like CODIS, that's the Combined DNA Index System. And the fact that we can now trace familial DNA, it's been a total game changer.
Yeah. The Golden State Killer case. That was a perfect example of that. Investigators used familial DNA to find him, decades after he committed his crimes. It's incredible, but also kind of scary to think about, that your past can catch up to you like that.
Yeah, it definitely sends a message to anyone thinking about getting away with murder. But aside from DNA, longer prison sentences have also played a part in reducing the number of serial killers out there. In the past, parole was a lot more common, even for violent offenders. And get this, in the 1980s, 18% of serial killers actually killed again after being let out on parole.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. It really shows how important it is to keep these people off the streets. But when I was reading through these articles, I noticed that it's not just about catching the killers. It's also about how society has changed in ways that make it tougher for them to even do what they do.
Yeah, that's a good point. Our world today is totally different from the world back in the 70s and 80s. Think about it. Back then, hitchhiking was normal. There were no cell phones, and parents weren't nearly as worried about where their kids were all the time. These days, we're so much more aware of safety, and our actions show that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm way more likely to share my location with friends or avoid walking alone at night and just be more aware of what's going on around me than I would have been even 10 years ago. It's like this collective shift in how we think about safety.
And that shift has had a huge impact. All those seemingly small changes we make, they add up to a much bigger change in how society works. It's like we've all become more careful, and that's definitely affected the opportunities for serial killers to find victims. It's amazing, isn't it, that this decline in serial killings, it's not just about catching them, but it's about society changing in a way that makes it harder for them to even work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like
Mhm.
we've collectively, you know, raised the bar for safety, so it's
Yeah.
harder for these predators to blend in and find victims.
Right. But we can't forget about the advances in psychological profiling and intervention. We're so much better now at spotting those warning signs and intervening before those fantasies turn into, actions.
Yeah. I remember reading about that with the FBI's behavioral science unit. They were so important in helping us understand the minds of serial killers.
Yeah.
And developing those profiling techniques.
Absolutely. Pioneers like Robert Ressler really led the way
Right.
in understanding what motivates these people and their behavioral patterns. For example, we now know that animal abuse, that's often a big red flag for potential violence towards humans.
That's scary, but also a really powerful tool for prevention. If we can spot those signs early, and if we might be able to step in, stop those impulses from, getting worse. But I have to admit, even with all these reasons for the decline, I still find myself drawn to, those true crime stories, especially about serial killers from the past.
It's a pretty common fascination. It's funny how it seems to be at its peak. While the phenomenon itself is fading away, maybe it's because these historical figures, like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, they've become almost mythical in our culture.
Yeah, it's true. Their stories have been told and retold so many times.
Yeah.
That they're almost larger than life in our minds.
Exactly. But, let's switch gears for a second. We've been focused on the good parts of this decline, but there's a darker side to all of this that we can't ignore.
You're talking about underreporting and all the hidden victims.
What?
That's the stuff that keeps me up at night.
Exactly. The fact that a crazy 40% of homicides in the U.S. are never solved. It's a reminder that we might not even have the full picture.
It's like we're looking at a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces, and we don't know what those missing pieces would show us.
And some of those pieces might actually be victims of serial killers who've gone undetected. The Murder Accountability Project, they use an algorithm to try and find potential serial killer cases that might have been overlooked. And their findings suggest that there could be as many as 2,000 unidentified serial killers operating since 1976.
Wow. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if those statistics about the decline are even accurate.
It definitely makes you think that the numbers might not tell the whole story.
And it's especially worrying when you consider
Yeah.
groups who are often overlooked.
Right, like Indigenous women. They face a murder rate that's 10 times higher than the national average. And so many cases are never solved. It's heartbreaking to think about all those families left without answers or justice.
It's a real tragedy, and it shows how there are biases in our justice system. This thing called missing white woman syndrome, where cases involving white female victims get way more attention from the media and resources that make things even worse.
It distorts our view of who's really at risk, and it makes whole communities feel like they don't matter. Exactly. It's a complicated issue with roots in societal inequalities, and it's something we need to be actively trying to fix.
This whole conversation
Yeah.
is making me realize how much we still don't know.
Oh, for sure. It's a field that's always changing, and we're always learning new things. One of the toughest things about identifying potential serial killer cases is how we categorize these crimes.
What do you mean?
Well, we tend to think that serial killers have a specific type, a preferred victim profile, like Ted Bundy targeting young women with long dark hair parted down the middle.
Right, that's like a classic image.
Yeah, but the reality is, it's way more complicated. Many serial killers, they change their methods over time, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. They might target victims of different races, genders, or ages, and they might operate in different places.
So the patterns might not be as clear as we think.
Exactly. If a killer's trying to avoid getting caught, they might choose victims who seem totally unrelated, which makes it harder for investigators to connect the dots, even with fancy algorithms.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces are changing shape all the time.
Exactly. And that's what makes serial killers so hard to catch and so scary.
It's chilling to think about. But let's get back to our fascination with serial killers, especially the ones from the past. Why are we so drawn to these stories, even though it seems like there are fewer of them out there now?
Well, there are a few theories. Some people think it's just morbid curiosity, like a desire to look into the dark side of humanity and try understand what could make someone do such terrible things.
I think there's some truth to that. It's like a car crash you can't look away from, even though you know it's awful. But there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Right. Others think it's a form of escapism, a way to experience danger and excitement. But from the safety of your own home, maybe there's even a bit of a hero complex, We imagine ourselves as the detectives or profilers, the ones who crack the case and catch the killer.
That's interesting. We like the idea of outsmarting the monster, being the one to solve the puzzle.
Exactly. And of course, there's the fear factor. We're drawn to stories that tap into our primal instincts, that remind us we're vulnerable. These stories are like a warning that even in our modern world, there are still dangers out there.
Like a primal warning system, to always be on guard and aware.
Right. But I think there's something even deeper going on. I think our fascination with serial killers is also about trying to find meaning in a world that can feel really chaotic and unpredictable.
I never thought of it like that. What do you mean?
Well, in their own twisted way, serial killers represent a kind of pure evil, a force that we can define and understand. They give us a way to make sense of the things that don't make sense, a way to categorize the darkness.
So it's like we're trying to create order out of chaos, impose some kind of logic on something that doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And maybe in doing that, we find a weird kind of comfort. Like we're not completely powerless against the darkness. We can study it, understand it, and maybe even stop it from happening again.
It's like we're trying to control the uncontrollable.
Maybe. But I also think it's about looking inward. By looking into the mind of a serial killer, we're also forced to look at the darker parts of ourselves.
Like looking into a distorted mirror and seeing the potential for good and evil.
Exactly. And maybe by recognizing that darkness within us, we can learn to understand it, manage it, and ultimately choose a different path.
That's deep. But before we get too philosophical, let's get back to some of those other theories about the decline of serial killers. One that's always interested me is the dark web theory.
Ah, yes, the idea that the internet, especially the darker parts of it, might be a place where people can act out their violent fantasies so they don't do it in real life.
It's kind of a disturbing thought. Like maybe we've just traded one form of darkness for another.
It's a controversial theory for sure, and there's no easy answer. On one hand, if these online communities really are just a harmless outlet, then maybe that's a good thing.
But on the other hand, you have to worry about those fantasies escalating and maybe even inspiring real violence. Wouldn't that go against the societal shift we were talking about before? Like even though we're more aware of physical safety, haven't we also created this whole other way for danger to find us?
That's a great point. The internet has changed everything, and we're still trying to figure it all out. It's like a double-edged sword. It can connect people and help us communicate, but it can also be a place where extremism and violence can grow.
How do we deal with that? How do we use the good parts of the internet while also minimizing the risks?
It's complicated, and there are no easy answers. But I think it starts with being open and honest about the potential consequences of how we act online. We need to educate ourselves and each other about the risks and be more careful about what we see and read online and the communities we join.
Yeah. It's easy to forget when you're online that there are real people on the other side of the screens.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that online, the line between fantasy and reality can get blurry. What seems harmless in a virtual world can have real consequences.
It's a good reminder that we need to be responsible online for our own good and for the good of others.
Okay, now moving away from the internet for a bit, there's another factor that experts believe has played a role in the decline of serial killers. And it goes back to that societal shift we discussed earlier. We've become way more aware of personal safety, and it shows in how we behave.
You mean like being more aware of our surroundings and taking precautions in our daily lives?
Right. Think about how much the world has changed since that so-called golden age of serial killers. Back then, hitchhiking was normal. Cell phones didn't exist, and parents weren't as worried about where their kids were all the time.
It was definitely a different time. People were more trusting, maybe, less aware of the dangers.
Yeah. And because of that, potential victims were more vulnerable, easier for predators to reach. But today, we're constantly bombarded with messages about personal safety. We're told to be careful of strangers, not to walk alone at night, lock our doors and windows, share our location with friends, and be aware of our surroundings.
It's a lot to think about sometimes. I know I've caught myself being a little too careful, maybe even a little paranoid.
I get it. But the truth is, those messages, even though they can make us anxious, they've had a big impact on how we act. We're more cautious, more aware of what's going on around us, and less likely to put ourselves in risky situations.
It's like we've all developed this stronger sense of self-preservation.
And that collective shift in behavior has made it way harder for serial killers to operate. They can't rely on the same tricks that worked in the past. They can't blend in as easily or gain trust or find unsuspecting victims.
It's like the game has changed. But hasn't that just forced them to become more sophisticated, more cunning in how they do things?
It's possible. Criminals are always adapting. But I think that the combination of increased awareness and all the technological advancements and the improvements in law enforcement have made it much harder for serial killers to do what they do.
And that's good to hear. That we're not just helpless victims, that we can actually do something to protect ourselves and each other.
That sense of agency is so important. It gives us the power to take responsibility for our own safety and to make the world a safer place. But let's not forget that even with all this progress, there's still a lot to do. We still have unsolved cases. We still have people who are more vulnerable. And we still have a long way to go in understanding what causes violence.
Yeah, it's a good reminder.
Yeah.
To never get complacent.
Exactly. We need to keep researching and learning and changing our strategies to address this issue because it's complex and always evolving.
And on that note, I think it's time to move on to the last part of our deep dive. We've talked about a lot. But there's one big question we still need to answer.
The question of why we're still so fascinated by serial killers, even though they seem to be declining.
Exactly. What is it about these dark figures that still captures our imagination? It's a question worth exploring.
Okay, so we've talked about that golden age of serial killers and all the possible reasons why they might be declining, and even that unsettling idea that there might be way more out there than we even realize.
Right, and we even talked about that whole underreporting issue and the difficulties in, figuring out which murders are connected and those biases in the system that sometimes leave vulnerable people more at risk.
And we can't forget about that weird fascination we all have with serial killers, especially those big names from the past.
It's like this pull towards the darkness, even though we're glad it seems to be fading.
So how do we explain that? Why are we still so captivated by these stories, even as we hope for a world where they happen less and less?
I think it gets at something deep in us, that curiosity about the extremes of human behavior, good and bad. It's like we're drawn to the edge to where the rules don't apply and things get blurry.
Like looking into the abyss, even though we know it might look bad. And maybe by staring into that darkness, we hope to understand it a little better, to get some insight into what it means to be human.
Maybe it's about trying to make sense of the things that just don't make sense, to find order in the chaos.
Maybe. Or maybe it's a way of facing our own fears, admitting that there's a potential for darkness in all of us.
That's a heavy thought, but it's a powerful one too. If we can admit that darkness is there, maybe we can figure out how to control it to make better choices.
Exactly. And that brings us to hope, to the idea that even with all the evil in the world, we can still grow and understand and make things better.
It's that hope that keeps us looking for answers, that keeps us working toward a safer and more just world for everyone.
A world where these horrible crimes happen less and less, where vulnerable people are protected, and where we meet darkness with compassion and understanding.
It's a vision worth fighting for.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into this heavy topic, let's hold on to that vision.
Let's remember the victims and their stories and keep working towards a world where their tragedies actually lead to positive change.
A world where we face darkness with courage, curiosity, and compassion, and where we never stop trying to understand ourselves and the world around us.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one last thought to consider. As you keep exploring true crime and grappling with these tough questions about human behavior, remember that this conversation isn't over.
Keep asking questions, keep challenging what you think you know, and keep looking for answers.
Because, as Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Keep examining, keep questioning, keep digging deeper.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.